Today is Wednesday, and it's March 8th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. You can imagine, as we work to try and restore classical Catholic education, and we try to promote challenging studies even among young children, that we get many requests for help, not with education, but with actual parenting, with actually establishing family culture, developing good habits among children. And one of the most important topics that comes up is how to discipline children, or whether parents should spank their children. And we get into this whole fascinating discussion about spanking children. And my wife recently received a number of questions about disciplining children and spanking and things like that, and so I thought it would be good for me to address this question myself and make this talk available to try to help guide this discussion and make it profitable, because it's one of those issues where we tend to fall off either side of the horse, and it's difficult to get up and get on top and keep our balance without going too far or not far enough in either direction. So I'd like to try to establish some principles so we don't get into some wacky legalistic nonsense, but can understand how we should think about all this, and have some principles to guide us so that we can make practical decisions day by day in the heat of the battle, as it were, with these little ones. And I think I can offer something helpful here, so I'd like to do so. And just before I get into this, let me just remind you that I'm a father of 10 children. I have 7 sons and 3 daughters. Currently, they range in age from 22, 23 actually, down to 8 years old. So we've been through different genders, different ages, all the way from birth up through early adulthood. And what I share, I think, will be marked by my experience. I have a very close-knit family, good relations with all my kids, and I think I can offer some helpful stuff. So let's dig into this a little bit and talk about this whole question of disciplining children, and to be really specific and frank about spanking kids. Okay, is it necessary? Is it good? When should we do it? How should we do it? On and on, all these practical questions. Let's try to establish some principles, talk about it reasonably, and then develop a plan that we can actually use to help guide our decisions as parents for the good of our kids and our families in general. What I'd like to do is ask you to read with me 2 Proverbs from the Old Testament, 2 selections from the book of Proverbs, which I think will give us the principle that we need. And I recommend you write these down and memorize them, or put them on the refrigerator or something, because this really is the answer to this question. You know, my wisdom, my intelligence simply consists of looking things up in authoritative sources. And the book of Proverbs is perhaps the best source for practical wisdom and guidance. And I'd like to give you, therefore, 2 passages, 2 Proverbs that'll guide this discussion as we try to think through this together. First of all, and I'm out in the woods here, so let me pull this up on my phone just so I can read it accurately for you. The first one is Proverbs chapter 26, verse 3. Proverbs 26, verse 3. Proverbs says the following, and remember, this is sacred scripture, inspired by God and absolutely certain, and you should receive it as such. Proverbs 26, verse 3. A whip for the horse, a bridle for the ass. That's talking about a donkey, not a child's bottom. A whip for the horse, a bridle for the ass, and a rod for the back of fools. A whip for the horse, a bridle for the ass, and a rod for the back of fools. That's Proverbs 26, verse 3. Okay, so keep that in mind. A whip for the horse, a bridle for the ass, and a rod for the back of fools. And so the proverb here teaches us that in order to control the behavior of a horse, we use a whip. In order to control the behavior or the movement of an ass or a donkey, we use a bridle. And in the same way, to control the behavior of a fool, we use a rod upon his back. Now, I'm not drawing any conclusions yet, so don't start running with this. We still have another passage that I want to read, but keep this in mind as the first part of this principle that we're going to establish here. That's just the first part. A whip for the horse, a bridle for the ass, and a rod for the back of fools. Now, the other passage that we're going to look at is Psalm 32. Psalm 32, verse 9. And just note that if you're using the old Dewey Reams Bible, the psalm numbers don't necessarily match up, and I always get this confused. So in the modern numbering system, which we find in newer Catholic Bibles, it's Psalm 32, and I forget which direction it goes. It could be Psalm 31 or Psalm 33 in the older Dewey Reams Bible, but this is from Psalm 32 according to the modern numbering. Psalm 32, verse 9, we read, "Do not become like the horse and the mule, who have no understanding. With bit and bridle bind fast their jaws, who come not near unto thee." Do not become like the horse and the mule, who have no understanding. And I'll stop there. Do not become like the horse and the mule, who have no understanding. So I want us to take these two passages, one from Proverbs 26:3, and this second passage from Psalm 32, verse 9. And you can see how these two passages go together to express a full idea, a full message. And that's why I said don't run ahead with that first verse, because there's more that needs to be added to it. In the first passage we looked at, we're told that it is necessary to use punishments in order to control the behavior of fools. That's clear. Just as we need to use a whip for a horse and a bridle for an ass, we need to use a rod to control the behavior of fools. However, in the psalm, we see the psalmist pleading with the person to not be a fool, saying, do not become like a horse or an ass. And here's the key, which have no understanding. Do not become like the horse or the ass, which have no understanding. And this gives us the full picture of how we need to think about this topic. And like I said, it's very common in modern society for parents to either not go far enough in managing the behavior of their children or to go too far. And Aristotle talked about how the golden mean is the balance between two opposite extremes, which are vices. And he said, what's difficult about virtue is that there are a million degrees, an infinite number, I should say, of degrees of error, and only one exact point of truth. And finding that point of truth without going too far or without going far enough is very difficult. And as parents, we have to realize that this is very difficult to talk about in any kind of systematic or methodical way. We have to realize that this is a discussion and a topic that requires just judgment in the face of differing circumstances. And so there's no simple rule, there's no dumb 3-step rule for how to raise saints. That whole idea you've got to get out of your head. We have to understand our role as parents and see that we fulfill it according to God's will. And it's very difficult. There's a lot of stuff that has to be kept in mind as we raise our children. Now, when we consider these two passages, we have to realize that there's an ideal situation and a worst case scenario. There's an ideal situation and a worst case scenario, or last resort. Obviously, the use of physical punishment of any kind is a last resort. And we see this in the psalm where the psalmist is pleading, do not be like the horse or the mule, which have no understanding. The ideal situation is for us to live together and get along with one another by means of understanding and reasoning. That's the ideal. And you should be praying that God helps you, the parents, and your children to be able to live together in a peaceful way where you're able to communicate by understanding and reasoning. That it would never come to a point where you need to resort to any kind of physical discipline. So that's the first concern. And if that's not your first concern, if that's not your mindset, well, then you're in trouble. That needs to be the mindset. We should never desire to spank a child. And it should only be necessary when it's actually necessary, when it's a last resort. And there's just a lot to talk about with this stuff. I hate to talk about it for one reason, being that I know that there are lots of crazy people out there, and if I don't carefully qualify every single thing I say, I'm going to have some wacko who thinks that beating his kids is some kind of sign of godliness, and there's just nothing that I can do about that kind of stuff. There's so many crazy people, especially among Christians, and if you talk about topics like these that require balance and judgment, self-examination, patience, and all the other virtues, these people won't hear all of these warnings, all of these qualifications, all of these distinctions. They'll just go right for the end and imagine that they've heard that you need to spank your kids to make them good. And that's not what I'm saying in the slightest way. And yet I know, no matter what I try to do to qualify things or to be careful, I know that the crazies will get a hold of any words that they choose and will run like the pigs off the cliff into the water in the Gospels. There's just nothing you can do about it. So I'm really not going to worry about the possibility that some internet wackos will listen to this and imagine that I said, physically punish your children, because I'm not saying that, and I know that it doesn't matter how many times I make that clear. They're just going to do whatever they want, and you've got the miserable Margarets out there who, no matter how long this talk goes, how many qualifications I make, etc., all that they will hear is that Mr. Michael said that you should beat your kids, and I've never said anything remotely close to that. So I'm just going to say that up front. I'm not going to worry about the internet crazies. I'm just going to talk to those who listen, who actually listen to the whole talk, pay attention to the details, and take these words with all of the qualifications and attempt that I make to be careful in these things. So that's that. Now, our children are not our servants. Our children are not our personal property. When we give birth to children and bring them into our families, they're not our little pets or robots that are created to do our will and help us. They're not our household servants. They're not our gardeners. They're not our, chore boys or anything like that. They're God's own creatures. They're God's children. And our relationship with them, as far as parenting goes, is temporary. It lasts until they're adults. And when they're adults, both legally and morally, and financially, and in just about every other way, they become independent. And they come out from under the authority of their parents, and they live their own lives as God's creatures, hopefully seeking by their own free will to live according to God's will. Our relation to them as parents, our duties to them as their parents, are temporary and they're limited. And we've always got to keep that into consideration when we raise them and talk about any discipline, because these aren't our own possessions to mold and shape into our own image to do our own will. That's not what children are. Our relationship to them with respect to parenting is temporary. They have free will, and they're going to enter into independent adulthood and make their own life decisions. I recommend you read paragraph 2230 in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. 2230. And again, write it on an index card, memorize it, put it on the refrigerator, and keep it always in front of your eyes, because it's crucial to not go crazy as a parent. Understand what your role actually is within God's will and stay in your lane. We also have to keep all of our Catholic theology in mind when we think about and talk about and make decisions about our children. We understand, according to Catholic theology, that all human beings are born into the world in sin. We're fallen creatures. Through baptism, the guilt of original sin is washed away, and we receive grace to begin to live the Christian life. And as we grow up, we have to make free will choices to collaborate with that grace to merit more grace and to continue that process of collaborating by our own free will or voluntarily with the grace that God gives us, step by step by step. While we are cleansed of the guilt of original sin and given grace through baptism, we remain in a state of weakness. We remain in a state where we are inclined to sin. This is called concupiscence. And that concupiscence remains with us our entire lives. It's why we still sin as Catholic adults. We're still prone to wander, as it were. That stays with us for life. And the way that we deal with this remaining sin is through the sacramental life. Venial sins are washed away by communion, by receiving the sacrament of the Eucharist. Every time we receive the Eucharist, our venial sins are washed away. That's why we pray the Confiteor at the beginning of Mass. And we receive the forgiveness of our venial sins. And then when we go beyond the limits of venial sins and intentionally and with understanding sin against God in some grave matter, we then seek to be reconciled through the sacrament of reconciliation by confessing our sins, doing penance, and amending our lives. This goes on for our entire lives. So when you look at your little Catholic child, you've got to understand that the little child is not supposed to be good and without all kinds of troubles and sinful inclinations and problems. And when there is a sinful inclination or a problem or a moral failure in your child, the sky is not falling, and your overreaction is a kind of insanity, where you throw out all of your knowledge of Catholic theology about human nature and the human condition and the sacraments and the nature of the Christian life and the mercy of God, and you act like a crazy person, usually because you're worried about what other people think. And most of this crazy talk about spanking kids is fueled by this kind of craziness, this irrational, thoughtless reacting to the faults of children in a hypocritical and exaggerated way, usually fueled by prideful concerns about what other people are going to think about our children or our family. We're raising sinners. We're raising sinners who are being saved by a patient and merciful God who has sent his Son into the world to save just such people by means not of instant perfection, but by an intentionally long and difficult process of sanctification that lasts this entire life. Another problem is that parents who aren't careful with their studies, who aren't discerning, have allowed all kinds of non-Catholic ideas into their heads that interfere with their ability to parent reasonably. For example, the Enlightenment ideas of John Locke, which taught that children are clean slates when they come into this world, and that they are made bad or corrupted by external influences that soil this clean slate. That's false teaching. We do not believe that human children are clean slates. They are fallen creatures born into a race of fallen creatures who have inherited an inclination to sin. And therefore, when we see sin in our children, it's not a sign that some external factor is attacking them or that they're being corrupted by some outside influence. So it can be, of course, but not necessarily. And ideas like this tabula rasa, or clean slate, which come from non-Catholic sources, these kinds of ideas get into the minds of parents and make them crazy. So we've got to study the Catholic faith, learn what the Catholic faith teaches us about human nature and the human condition. We've got to think about the way of salvation, how God actually sanctifies us in this life, and we've got to develop a vision of parenting that is actually in agreement with the truth. And most parents don't do this. Like I said, they either go too far in attempting to physically restrain and control their children's behavior, or they set hypocritical standards in judging their children, or they don't go far enough. There are an infinite number of ways to err, and only one way to keep the truth. It's difficult. So we've got to keep all that we learn in view and allow it to direct these discussions and decisions. Secondly, all of us are going to have different children in different circumstances. Our children individually, as regards their personalities, their character, their own inclinations, they're going to be different. And there's not a one-size-fits-all rule for parenting. It doesn't work like that. As a parent, you're going to have to get to know your own children, and you're going to have to learn how they are influenced. Some of your children will be relatively good and reasonable, and they'll never require anything more than a word. A frown can turn them upside down. And you may have other children where even if you whip them all day long, it would hardly slow them down. And I'm exaggerating, obviously, but just to show that there's a broad spectrum, there's a great variety in the personalities of children. And it's complicated, circumstantial decision-making that's necessary from parents. There's no lazy trick or method to do this stuff. As a parent, you're asked to stand in the place of a judge, to take into consideration all of the circumstances, to take into consideration the laws, to take into consideration the conditions, provocations, to consider what would bring about reform or improvement, what's necessary for the protection of others. All of these issues of judgment and justice, you're required to administer at the domestic level. It's challenging stuff. What the judge does at the political level, you're asked to do at the domestic level. That's how our society works. The state is composed of families. And each of these little families is like a little state of its own that has its own government, that has its own laws, its own courts, its own law enforcement. And parents have to realize that they have the position of lawmaker, teacher, police officer, judge, and so on. And just as these are complex matters in political society, they're also complex matters in domestic society. And there's no easy way. There's no dumb, how to discipline your children for dummies that's possible. You've got to become a wise, mature Christian adult. So that's the challenge. Circumstances are always going to be changing. Individual children are going to be different. They're going to respond different to different means of correction. And as a parent, you've got to be invested in the children to understand and know them and to be able to manage them prudently with, again, the ideal being discussion and reasoning, and the last resort being any kind of physical discipline. Remember the psalmist pleading, "Do not be without understanding, like the horse or the mule, but rather be reasonable." Listen, be reasonable. But if the children will not listen, other means, like the whip and the bridle, just as symbols, don't read into them literally, but as symbols of physical measures that need to be taken, practical measures that need to be taken to prevent harmful behavior, will need to be determined according to the circumstances. Now, let's just get right to it. Is there a time when it's necessary to physically discipline children? The answer is absolutely yes. There is definitely a time and a place for the physical discipline of children, and we can't worry about what crazy people say who don't take responsibility for their children's behavior, or who have children who, by God's grace, don't need much physical correction to behave well, but who unreasonably and unjustly judge other parents dealing with different children and different circumstances. The discipline of other people's children is none of your business. And we shouldn't get into that stuff. We should leave that to parents because God leaves it to parents and the state leaves it to parents. And just because our children don't need this or that doesn't mean other children don't need this or that. Again, it's none of our business. It's none of our business. But there is certainly a place and a time where a child needs to be physically disciplined. And I'll give you some examples. You may see a child who doesn't listen to his parents' voice. The child will be doing something, the parent will speak, and the child will not even pay attention to the parent's voice. That's a dangerous situation, because what you see there is a child who is not living with understanding. He's not controlled by words, by instructions, by restrictions, prohibitions, and so on. The parent speaks and the child acts as if he or she doesn't even hear his parent's voice. That's a child in trouble. That's a child who, when running towards the road, when the parent yells, "Stop," has been conditioned to not listen. That's why I say that child is in trouble. When that child is given instructions like, "Don't talk to strangers," or if you're walking home, don't stop and talk to someone in a car that you don't recognize. Children who don't listen to their parents are in trouble. And we can't listen to these crazies in our society who argue for this crazy, boundless freedom of children, who are not going to be there to help us when a kid gets hit by a car or kidnapped. It's none of their business, and we need to learn not to listen to these people. If a child does not listen to his parents' voice, it's impossible for the parents to manage that child with words. And the purpose of physical correction is not just to physically injure a child, which obviously doesn't help anything. The purpose of physical correction is to make the child listen to the parent's voice. And I'll give you a simple illustration from dealing with animals. Because remember, that's what the Proverbs teaches us, that this idea relates to the care of animals because animals are not reasonable. They don't have understanding. They cannot be reasoned with. And therefore they have to be physically controlled. Think about what we do with animals. By nature, animals will not listen to our voice. We train our animals to listen to our voice. So, for example, if we get a puppy, we'll use treats to teach the puppy to listen to commands. We'll call the puppy by its name and we'll give it a treat. And the puppy will learn to recognize its name and to come. It's trained to listen and hear spoken instructions by means of physical treats. We'll tell the puppy to sit, and we'll reward the puppy with petting or with a treat. And the puppy will learn that when it hears the spoken command sit, to sit in anticipation of a reward. The puppy does not have understanding, the puppy is not reasonable, and it's not really responding to our spoken instructions. It's being conditioned to respond by means of a physical control. We do the same thing when we take a dog for a walk on a leash and we train it to walk on a leash. We have to train the dog to listen because as we're walking, other animals may come along the way. Our dog has to listen, or other children may come along the way. The dog has to listen, or someone could get injured. Another dog could get injured, and so on. We have to make the dog listen to commands. And so what we'll do is, as we're walking the dog on the leash, if the dog starts to run ahead, we'll sharply yank back on the leash to make it painful after we give a command, like stop, or even a sound like eh, eh. We'll make the sound and then give the leash a tug, which is painful to the dog, but the dog will learn to hear that sound and anticipate the pain, and it'll learn to stop before the pain comes. It'll learn to stop on the spoken sound rather than on the jerk of the leash. And we use this physical correction not to punish the animal, which makes no sense, but to teach the animal and to train the animal to listen and respond to spoken commands. That's what we do with animals. And everyone knows that horses, we're told the whip for the horse, but horses obey spoken commands. On the farm, we've had draft horses, where you can take horses out into a field or tie a carriage to the horses and simply give verbal commands. And they go. They stop, they turn, they back up, and so on, with simple verbal commands. And they learn, in the midst of all different noises around them, they learn to hear the voice of their master. We use the whip on the horse when it won't listen. And we do it for the sake of safety, for the horse's safety, for the safety of others. And we do it usually to train the horse to listen to spoken commands. This is the purpose of any physical discipline in a child's life. Physical discipline is not used as some kind of retributive justice. Physical discipline is used when the child is not listening to spoken commands. And notice that physical discipline is both positive and negative. It's not just spanking kids, as many stupidly talk about. Not spanking kids after the fact. That makes very little sense. And it's certainly not our goal as parents. We want our children to be good. We want our children to listen. We want to be able to control our children's behavior by spoken instructions. But we have to train the children, especially when they're young, we have to train them to give attention to those spoken instructions, and sometimes not even spoken instructions, but simple gestures. And this is what makes for well-disciplined children. So if I'm at church, and I don't have to deal with this anymore because my children are older, but when our children were younger, if they were messing around in the pew at church, if I simply made a noise with my mouth, like, they would look at me and know that I was watching them. And they would quiet down and be still. And again, I don't care what anybody thinks about this stuff. My wife and I were praised for our children's behavior. Our children were able to, and have been able to, enjoy participation in the Mass their entire lives. They've received innumerable opportunities to do things because of their behavior. They've been altar servers, on and on and on. while other people will criticize these things, whose kids live despised by their neighbors, if not hated because of their bad behavior. We have to learn not to care what those people say. They're cruel. Their children suffer 1,000 losses because of their lack of discipline. I can simply clear my throat or make a sound with my mouth or even look over, and my children understand the message loud and clear. People would come up to us after church and ask, "How do you make your children behave so well?" Well, that's a long story, and you probably aren't going to like what I have to say. But you love the results, and that's usually how it is. Everyone loves the idea of having respectful, attentive, obedient children, but they'll turn right around and criticize you when you actually do the work that makes them well-behaved and attentive and well-liked by other people. And you've just got to learn to ignore that. Now, I've had some children who were bad kids, and they've had to be dealt with pretty roughly to make them listen, to persuade them that they are going to listen to spoken instructions. And I've had other children who I've hardly had to say a word to. For example, my oldest son, my firstborn son, Jonathan, he was a nightmare. From the time he was little, he needed to be physically disciplined constantly. My youngest child, Anna, I don't know that I've ever had to physically discipline her at all. She's been loving and attentive and obedient her whole childhood. The kids are totally different. But they are all disciplined in different ways, in different circumstances. Their experiences are all different. The influences in their lives are all different. For example, with my oldest child, we had to establish our Christian culture in a family where we were the only Christians. And that took great discipline, great efforts to establish positive Christian culture and to train our children according to that culture. Our younger children were raised in a home where that culture was already established, even among their older brothers and sisters. They didn't need the same kind of discipline that our older children needed. And our youngest children, like I said, hardly need any discipline at all. So, to talk about this topic of spanking, and remember that this is a last resort. This is a last resort, and the purpose of any kind of physical correction, any kind, and that includes taking away a child's meal, making a child sit in his bedroom, making a child stand in the corner, making a child sit at the table, spanking a child's bottom, on and on, whatever the means may be. And there are different reasons for different means and different times for different means, and different means are received differently by different children. We have to remember that the goal is to teach the child to respond to spoken instructions. Do not be without understanding like the horse or the mule. That's the message. We're telling our children, listen. Listen to my words. Listen to my voice. Don't ignore my instructions. You have to learn to listen, or you're going to be in trouble. Not with me, but with the entire world. You may even lose your life if you don't listen. The goal of any kind of physical correction is to make physical correction unnecessary. And even more importantly, the goal of any physical correction is to save our children's lives. If my son one day stumbled out the door as a toddler and was walking down the driveway towards the street while a truck was coming, and I yell, "David, stop!" If he's not trained to instantly respond to my voice, he could be run over in the street. And it's that kind of training to listen, to hear, and respond immediately to verbal instructions that can save a child's life. The same thing is true with any animal. And so we've got to keep in mind the purpose and the goal of any kind of discipline. If the child responds to verbal instructions, physical correction is not necessary. And I should just repeat this and repeat this. If the child responds to verbal instructions or verbal commands, then that child does not need physical correction. If you say stop and the child stops, that child does not need any physical chastisement. If a child can be reasoned with, the child does not need to be physically disciplined. A whip for a horse, a bridle for an ass, and a rod for the back of fools. That is, those who despise instruction, who will not listen, and so on. If the child listens to verbal commands, there's no need for physical discipline. It may come up once in a while, but in general, that kid is in good shape. And you can tell that by simply speaking to the child and see if the child listens and responds when spoken to. That's the goal. To be able to have a relationship with your child where all that's needed is to speak. Just as you would experience with a pet. I don't want to have to give my dog treats every single time he needs to do something. I don't want to yank on my dog's collar every single time we go for a walk. The goal is to have the dog sit or stay or lay down when he's told to, and to have him listen to my voice even if there are provocations. And well-trained dogs are really amazing in how they can listen and respond to verbal commands, even in the midst of chaos and noise. That's the idea. Now, some may say, why do you talk about children as if they're animals? Well, it's because children are like animals. If you know Catholic teaching, again, this is all conditional, and if you're the kind of person who rejects Catholic teaching, I really don't care about your opinion, because I'm reasoning from Catholic teaching. The Catholic Church teaches that children come to the age of reason around 7 or 8 years old. That's around the time when they receive First Communion. So if I'm dealing with a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, I'm dealing with a creature that is not yet reasoning. Therefore, that child is like an animal. The child is dealt with in a way that's similar to animals. It's a part of their life. It's a part of their development. They're trained like animals when they're young. They're established in good habits before they reach the age of reason. And those habits are established by simple physical means. So if you wonder why we would talk about children like animals, it's because, according to church teaching, children are like animals when they're young. And the faculty of reasoning, which is a natural power that they're born with, develops over time. But what we should learn from this is that when reasoning comes to a child at age 7 or 8, that child should already be established in good habits by means of physical discipline. And physical discipline does not mean spanking. It means any means by which the child is trained to listen and respond to verbal instructions. And we also have to make it clear that family routines establish good habits in children and prevent bad habits. And when the parents are disorderly and lazy and chaotic, their children don't have the benefit of learning how to act properly just because they're used to the daily routine of family life. And parents who act like that are often hypocritical, and while they refuse to subject themselves to any discipline or order, they then turn to some kind of physical punishment as if their children should be ordering themselves when their parents don't order themselves. That's hypocrisy, and that's just the road to total destruction. So it's like there are a number of gates that we go through before we get to the problem where a child needs a spanking or a slap on the hand, or even a flick on the leg, or anything, a pinch. Those things are necessary, but there's a whole set of gates that we need to go through that should be dealt with responsibly before we get to that point. For example, if we're going to Mass, we're going to go sit in a church, we want our children to be quiet and respectful. We want our children to sit still, to not be climbing around or fidgeting during the Mass. Well, our children should learn to behave respectfully and quietly in a religious setting because we pray at home. They should learn that because they're used to sitting and being quiet and praying at home. So when we go to church, sitting and praying and being quiet is not something new. And when we see these kids at church who are climbing all over the seats and screaming and rolling around and slapping their mothers in the faces, the problem is that the child is not being given routines at home that allow the behavior to be established as normal. We see the normal behavior in that child is to scream and yell and climb around and smack his mother and all these different things. We can see that those have been allowed to establish as normal behaviors, and now the child, at some random time in his week, is being told to sit and be quiet and be still, when he never sits and is never quiet and is never still. That's just poor parenting. You can't ask a child to behave in public with 1,000 things going on when that behavior hasn't been established as normal. That's bad parenting. And I'm not criticizing parents, I'm just saying you can't do that. You can't expect the children to respond well in that situation. There are ways to discipline the children, and it takes place over time. For example, in our family, when we would go to church, every day after church, we come home from church, everyone gets changed, and then my wife usually prepares a snack for everyone after church. So around noon, we come home, everyone gets changed into comfortable clothes. My wife usually puts a pot of coffee on. She may make the kids some hot chocolate, make some muffins, something like that. My wife always has something prepared after church. Well, in our family, if you misbehave during church, if you're fidgeting around, making noise, and you need to be spoken to and corrected at church, you lose your snack after church. And that's all we've ever needed to do to have our kids behave well at church. Sure, there have been times where they acted badly at church and they lost their snack after church, and they learned that they didn't want to do that. So like I said, when people at church ask me, how do you get your children to behave so well? The answer is very simple. They know that if they misbehave during church, they're not going to eat when they go home. They like to eat. Therefore, they behave at church. And it's simple routines like that. It has to do with your family schedule. For example, in our homeschool, our day is divided into different periods of the day. So we've got a morning period, an afternoon period, and an evening period. During the morning period, the kids have work to do, and at the end of the morning period, lunchtime, they have a meal. Well, if you don't do what you're supposed to do during the morning period, you don't get your meal at lunch. And I don't care what anybody says, the kids learn very quickly to be good. It has the opposite effect that all the crazies say it will have. In the afternoon school period, they've got studies to do, they've got tasks to do, and if they do what they're supposed to do, they have recess and dinner in the evening. And then after dinner time, they have more things to do, and if they do all the things they're supposed to do, they get some free time in the evening before bed to watch a movie or play some games, relax, have a snack, and so on. The 3 periods of the day are all followed by periods where they're rewarded for good behavior. And so we have controls on their daily activities, and we give them reasons to do what they're told to do. What do other parents do? They do the opposite. They'll give the kids breakfast first. They'll wake up and have breakfast, so the kids are now fed. They haven't done anything. So now the kids are full of food, full of energy, and now they're being told to go have school time. The parents are going to give them lunch no matter what, because the mother thinks that if you miss lunch, you become demon-possessed or whatever. And the kids are fed before they work. They're always rewarded before they work. Play comes before work. Food comes before work. And so there's never any natural motive to work. And it's just a scheduling problem. It's an unreasonable and immoral schedule. St. Paul says, "He who does not work, the same shall not eat." Eating comes after, not before work. We work so that we may eat, and we eat so that we may do more work. We don't get paid first, we work first, and then we get paid. That's justice. So it could be scheduling that's a cause of the problem. And as you can see, as we continue to talk through this, there are so many different issues to consider that really spanking becomes less and less and less significant. Because the only time that we would resort to spanking was when all else failed, and it was the last resort. And there are times where you may get a kid who is just incorrigible. He is impossible to correct. You can take away his lunch and he'll look at you and say, "I don't care." Spanking is a last resort. And again, it doesn't matter what the crazies say when they tell you that that's cruel or this or that. It doesn't matter what they say. It's a last resort because we have to make our children listen. They have to learn to listen, or their lives are in danger. They have to learn to listen. If children do not listen to their parents, no matter what any of the crazies say, they are hated by people around them. They lose a million opportunities that good children, that obedient children enjoy. Many don't realize this because their children are simply not offered benefits or opportunities that other children are offered. They don't understand these things exist because their children are never offered these things. They don't have strangers come up to their children and ask them if they would like to work. They don't have their parents get phone calls asking if their children would be interested in jobs. They don't experience these things because no one wants to be around their children. But parents who have disciplined children, who are well behaved and who become known for being well behaved, know that their children receive 1,000 benefits for the discipline that they've received. And the children come to learn and appreciate that. The children come to learn and appreciate that their parents' discipline has brought them many benefits. My children, my older children, talk about it all the time, about how many times they receive rewards and opportunities and praise as young adults because of things that were trained into them and that they were disciplined for as kids. Aristotle teaches in the Rhetoric that the two virtues of youth, the two virtues of young boys, are temperance and courage. Temperance and courage. And temperance and courage do not come by being spoiled and babied. Padre Pio said, "Beatings and bread make beautiful boys." Beatings and bread make beautiful boys. Temperance and courage are the virtues of youth. The crazies who will criticize you for disciplining your children, they've never studied any of these subjects. They don't know moral philosophy. They take no responsibility for their children's behavior, and they need to be ignored. But at the same time, if you lose focus of the principles or the goals of parenting and just get into this dopey eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth nonsense of spanking your kids, you deserve the criticism you get, because that's not what parenting is about. And that's why I say I can try to temper this talk, and I can give all of these conditions and qualifications, and I know that one person will listen to this and understand all that and benefit from it, and another person will pull one sentence out of it like a wacko and run off the cliff. And there's nothing I can do about that. And that's just a problem with parenting. When my wife asks me to talk about this stuff, I just say, how can you talk to someone about parenting? It's so complicated. It requires so much virtue, so much discipline, so much patience, so much constant vigilance. What can you possibly say to another person? Because I have no idea if another person is doing all these things and studying all these things and thinking through all these things and building a relationship with their children, establishing household routines, maintaining their own self-discipline and order. I don't know if people are doing all these things. And so I would never recommend to some out-of-control maniac to start spanking their kids. That's not how it works. So I really don't know what's to be said. If you're not wise, and you're not just, and you're not disciplined, and you're not virtuous, and you're not religious, I don't know how you would possibly be a good parent with well-behaved children when you're not well-behaved yourself. There are principles that we can talk about, but only the virtuous and careful and wise and self-controlled people would listen to them anyway. So I'm not sure how helpful a talk like this can even be, because the people who will receive it well probably already know and are working on these things, and the people who can't figure them out, they probably can't figure them out for other reasons, and I'm not sure that they're willing to change those things. So anyway, I think I've covered all the basics. I hope that that's helpful. It's certainly been long enough. But I would send you back, though, to those two passages. The first from Proverbs 26:3, and the second from Psalm 32, whatever the verse was, I forget, 7 or 9, to understand that the goal of parenting is to raise children who listen to your voice and who can be reasoned with and spoken to. Under the age of 8, you're not dealing with a rational person. They have the faculty of reason, but it hasn't developed yet. It's just like their adult teeth. They have teeth, but their adult teeth are not present yet. They're growing and developing. They're human beings still in a state of potentiality, still becoming human beings. And those early years of parenting, in God's providence, require animal-like management to establish routines and habits and so on. And disorderly people, I just don't see how they have any chance if they don't take household order, self-discipline, and such seriously. But I hope that this talk at least gives you some things to think about, and if you'd like to now take the content of this talk and ask some new questions and go further and discuss this more, I'd be happy to do that. But I hope that that's helpful. There's a lot to think and talk about. I'm sure that the comments will be filled with craziness from the wackies, and I've tried as much as I can to talk about this subject in a qualified way, and hopefully it'll be helpful. But I'm used to the craziness. So if you'd like to follow up and get into this more, please get in touch, and we'll do so. God bless.